What if you had too many absences for your naturalization application, all because of COVID? Well, the first thing to do is structure your argument in accordance with what the guidance provides. So the naturalization guidance states, as relevant, where the applicant has absences between 480 and 900 days for applications under Section 6.1, let's just stick to those for the moment, of the British Nationality Act, and otherwise meets the requirements, you must only consider exercising discretion where the applicant has established their home, employment, family, and finances in the UK. So let's assume you can do that. Usually that's easy. And one or more of the following applies. So you only need to satisfy one of these. And the first one is at least 2 years residence without substantial absences immediately prior to the beginning of the qualifying period. That's if the period of absence is greater than 730 days. The period of residence must be at least 3 years. So if it's greater than 730 days, the period of residence must be at least 3 years without substantial absences. So you would want to say something like this. You'd want to say that my absence count is, let's say, 750 days in the qualifying period from August 2019 to August 2024, right? That's when I'm making this video. And I confirmed that I had 3 years residence in the 3-year period from August 2016 to August 2019. In other words, immediately before the qualifying period, I did not have substantial absences in this 3-year period. So that's what you would be arguing. And that's the starting point, because if you can satisfy that, then you don't even need to turn to the other two grounds of argument, which I'll deal with shortly. If you can establish that. Now, having records of your residence from that time ago, so from 8 years back, right, because you're looking at that 3-year period and then the 5-year qualifying period might be a challenge. Now, one of the things you can do is a subject access request. I've done a separate video on how you can do that. You could make a subject access request, and that will give you the government's records of when they think that you've been absent, and you can go that far back. So that would be the starting point. But you may also be looking at your email inbox for any records of flights that you might have, any hotel bookings and that sort of thing. One of the points I've mentioned on previous videos in different connection is the Google Maps data, because if you've subject to your permissions, Google Maps tracks your GPS location. So that will tell you exactly where you were when. Now, whether you're arguing that or not, you should still argue the other grounds in the alternative. But what I've seen is people just don't take that point at all. So that's why I'm mentioning that first. So the second one is exceptionally compelling reasons of an occupational or compassionate nature to justify naturalization now. Now, the example they give there is such as a firm job offer where British citizenship is a statutory or mandatory requirement. So that's not applicable here. But exceptionally compelling reasons of a compassionate nature is a very broad test, and that could encompass you looking after a relative overseas, for example, or a whole range of circumstances. And then the third ground, which is most relevant, which is the one they leave to last, is the excess absences were because the applicant was unable to return to the UK because of global pandemic. Now, that was interestingly, that was put in way before COVID, and it was just, whenever I looked at that before COVID years back, I used to think, well, that's never going to come up. In fact, it's unhelpful they've put it in there because it's so restrictive. But of course, after COVID, it's now very helpful. And oddly, the guidance hasn't actually been expanded to deal with COVID absences in the way that it has for ILR applications. And it operates different. Absences in this context operate differently. So with ILR applications, if you can get it under an exception, then the absence will be discounted as if you were in the UK, as if the absence had not taken place. But it doesn't operate that way in connection with naturalization. But you should, of course, argue it under this ground. So basically, you're going to have 3 grounds, or up to 3 grounds, depending on your circumstances. If you're running COVID absences, and you may be in a position where you've you've already run the COVID absences arguments for ILR, and now you're doing so again in connection with your naturalization application a year later. But that may or may not be the case. The other point the key point that people also forget when they're making naturalization applications is you've got to prove that you were in the UK, physically in the UK 5 years before making the application. And that's super important. And in fact, it's the main reason why naturalization applications are refused. They have tightened up more generally. So before I go on to other points, on that point about proving you're in the UK, one of the ways you could do that is through a bank transaction, for example, made on the date 5 years ago. So, if you have a transaction at Marks and Spencer's, John Lewis or something like that, or made in the UK and is clearly on the bank statement, then that would be proof, and I would rely on that. You can go to other lengths. You could just rely on your travel history generally to prove it, but I prefer to be very specific because it's something the caseworker's got to satisfy themselves of. So I'd address it directly like that with a direct piece of evidence. But don't make your application when 5 years ago you are out of the country, because that could lead to refusal. Sometimes the caseworker can just sit on the application and consider it on a later date, but it can lead to complications, so I wouldn't recommend that. Now, in terms of the test they apply when looking at evidence, it has got more and more onerous. So make sure that you provide, ideally, a doctor's letter saying if it was the case that it was not safe or appropriate for you to come back to the UK if you were abroad for the following reasons. And what I usually do is a swim lane diagram, because usually it's not just one reason for you being out of the UK during COVID, but multiple reasons. It could be your own health, it could be a family member's health, it could be flight disruption, it could be lockdowns in the UK, or it could be lockdowns overseas where you were at the time. So sometimes there's multiple independent reasons, and you should put them in that way, but with a chronology, ideally with a swim lane diagram, so that it's very, very clear what the reasons were at the different times. Otherwise, you could end up with a decision that is to the effect that, you've covered this month to this month, but you haven't covered you haven't covered X month to Y month. So in other words, there can be confusion about the periods of time that you have actually accounted for. Whereas if there's a swim lane diagram and it's unambiguously set out, then that's much more compelling. So good luck with your application. I do have a consultation service. If you would like help, I'd be delighted to assist you. You can get me on the link below and select a time. Bye for now.